artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, welcome to episode 243. A few weeks ago, we had the 2024 Wrap-Up and Predictions panel, and there was so much fascinating discussion about AI in religion with panelist Beth Singler that I said we should have her back on the show by herself to talk about that. And here she is. Beth is the Assistant Professor in Digital Religions and co-lead of the Media Existential Encounters and Evolving Technology Lab at the University of Zurich, where she leads projects on religion and AI. As an anthropologist, her research addresses the human, religious, cultural, social, and ethical implications of developments in AI and robotics. She received the 2021 Digital Religion Research Award from the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies. Her popular science communication work includes a series of award-winning short documentaries on AI, which I really recommend. You can find them linked off her website. They're called Fear in the Machine, Friend in the Machine, Good in the Machine, and Ghost in the Machine. She also wrote and presented a BBC Radio 4 documentary on the cultural impact of The Terminator, 40 years on. She's been on New Scientist Live, Ars Electronica, the Edinburgh Science Festival, the Cheltenham Science Festival, and has appeared several times on BBC Click and BBC Click Live, and on BBC Radio 3 for The Year of Blade Runner. She's co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI, and author of Religion and AI, An Introduction, both published last year. We're going to talk about why religion and AI is a thing and what its dimensions are, the influence of science fiction, tropes like end times, AI used in religious roles, the singularity, and that's just this week. We're going through the looking glass on this one, so let's get right into the interview. Well, Beth Singler, it's a pleasure to welcome you back again to AI and You, and we're here to talk about religion and AI, and you have a recent book in that respect that we were talking about just a few weeks ago, and that's why we are here now, Religion and Artificial Intelligence, An Introduction, and you had some personal experiences that were formative in the reason for writing this. Maybe you could describe some of those because I think they're illuminating.
Yes, so I've been thinking around religion and technology as a scholar since around 2010, but it was around 2016 I moved more directly into thinking about religion and artificial intelligence. And you sort of set yourself off into the subject and try and find out who's important to talk to, and you go to conferences. And of course, you introduce yourself and you might say, as I was then, I'm a postdoc at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. And the reaction is sort of shock in some places that these two things could even be discussed in the same breath. And then to talk about religion and AI and people being very surprised that even those two things would go together. And conversely, in some spaces, having people being surprised that religion has anything to do with a technology like AI because, and I quote, in one instance, someone said, religion is just beliefs. It's nothing but that. And as an anthropologist of religion, I say, no, it's institutions and people and communities and cultures and dogmas and technologies specifically. So in this sort of area of religion and AI, there is a certain amount of skepticism I encounter that these two subjects have anything to do with each other. One is seen as very much a thing of the past by some people, something that needs to be left behind. AI is described more as something that's coming from the future. So you get these intersecting points. And I tend to describe them in terms of being entangled with each other, that actually the relationship is very much there and quite complicated in some instances.
And I guess by now I shouldn't be surprised, but I still am at the level of parochialism that you encountered there that still shocks and disappoints me when I encounter that from leading academics. But it does remind me of a sort of prevalent mindset among the people that create AI. Software developers have got to be among the least religious people on earth. And I would say that a common mindset among them is not merely that religion doesn't exist, but that humans don't either. They kind of take themselves and anything oriented around soft topics, beliefs, emotions out of the equation, because if it can't be measured, they're not interested in it. I'm describing perhaps one end of the spectrum there, and spectrum quite deliberately, but it's also a characteristic. So that would tend to make it look like AI and religion don't intersect to people like that. How broadly, and we're going to have to drill down into this, but how broadly would you say AI and religion at the intersection of those two things is of interest?
Oh, well, I mean, of absolute interest to me in particular, but I think that extreme of negativity that I encountered is definitely present. You're absolutely right for some voices in this space. But I would also say I've spent time within some corporations where they have actually sort of religious reading groups within them, or in some cases, Bible study groups, depending on fake. So it's not that religion is entirely absent in this sphere. And a lot of my work is about thinking about both that's explicit religiosity that would represent, having people who are expressing their religion in an AI space, but also the implicit religiosity of observing and discussing AI as something that can be described in religious ways with narratives and tropes that would be very familiar to anyone who's spent any time thinking about religion. So I tend to describe the relationship, these entanglements, in sort of four broad areas. So the explicit use of the technology by established religions, including also more negative relationships where established religions are rejecting artificial intelligence. That more implicit discussion of AI using religious terms and imagery, whether, the person who's using them or the organization is religious itself at all. We tend to draw on these sorts of cultural contexts to describe things. The development of strong new atheist narratives around AI that would strongly suggest that religion, as I said, is this thing of the past that needs to be gotten away from, and the future is a future without religion. And the development of AI new religious movements, so groups that don't fall into the structures that we're more familiar with established religions, but are trying to sort of break out into a new sphere of coming up with a conception of AI that fits their spiritual ideas already. So new institutions and new forms. So there's a lot of material there. There's a lot of things to get involved in as an anthropologist, and there's lots of areas of research.
Exactly. I mean, I was just writing down categories like fiction, faith in AI's outcomes, and singularitarianism, the belief in the singularity. I mean, it's called the rapture of the nerds, and you get into that. AI interpreting religion, what can it do? I mean, we've even seen AI used to image scrolls that were too fragile to be unrolled. AI Jesus, I mean, the dimensions of this are enormous. Mm-hmm. And how broad is your definition of religion in this context? Does it, for instance, require the usual component of a charismatic leader?
Yeah, my definition does tend to be very broad, and there's a long-standing discussion in the study of religion from both sides, suggesting we should have narrow definitions, other groups wanting broader definitions. I tend towards the broad end of the spectrum. I think a lot of our historical attempts at defining religion have had a very narrow origin in suggesting that if it doesn't look like something like Western Christian Protestantism with a religious building or a religious text or a creed and forms of prayer and specific types of worship, then it's not going to fit into our conception of religion. And there's been many scholars who've written about the problems of Western forms of scholarship engaging with other religions that aren't Christianity. And then you get to broadly the middle of the 20th century, and people start writing and talking more about new religious movements and new spiritualities, the New Age movement as well, and finding these things that don't fit even into the more modified forms of religious definition. So when I talk about implicit religion, that's a term specifically from a scholar who's sadly not with us anymore called Edward Bailey, and it has this slightly more broad understanding of people's behaviors fitting into what we might call religiosity in particular ways. Now, not everyone likes that. If I go around pointing at things and saying that's implicit religion, some people go absolutely not. And if we point at too many things and say they're implicitly religious, people start saying, well, if everything's religious, then nothing is. And some people prefer the word spirituality as well. So it's a complicated area within my field. And then it's even more complicated when you start talking to groups that might not want to be called religious at all. They might already be very antithetical towards the idea of religion.
How big of a footprint does science fiction have on this field in terms of how it has shaped and created some of our beliefs? I can think of two classic science fiction stories already. One that promotes the idea of AI becoming God, and this is the artificial superintelligence belief structure that we're afraid of, where they build the ultimate computer, and how many instances of that are there, and ask it, is there a God? And it fuses its power supply so that it can't be shut off and says there is now.
Yes.
And then there's Arthur C. Clarke's 9 billion names of God, which is listing every possible name for God through some kind of combinatorial process that was then foreseen to have brought about the end of the universe if you actually completed doing it. And they do that using a computer and find out that actually was the case, and there's no monotheistic entity in that one either. And so through all this spectrum, what are the major ways in which science fiction shapes the way that we identify that intersection of AI and religion?
Yeah, so absolutely. Science fiction gets us to a very exponential view of AI very quickly. You look at the history of discussions of AI in science fiction, and it's pushing the limits of what the technology can do and going beyond it. I mean, the technological singularity, Werner Vinge, his concept of that, he was also writing science fiction around it, as well as his non-fiction books where he's setting out this idea of the technological singularity. So science fiction has always sort of rushed forward into these bigger and bigger models of what AI could be, the superintelligence, the singularity. It causes some problems for some science fiction writers. I think Charles Stross wrote about in one of his blogs that how the singularity concept was the, turd in the toilet bowl of science fiction, because it just presented a scenario which couldn't be described. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Lots of science fiction authors have obviously gone on and tried to explain this unexplainable thing beyond the event horizon of exponential intelligence. But yeah, absolutely, science fiction has been there in every conversation about AI, in the way we illustrate stories about AI in the media. As soon as something's slightly dystopian, we have Terminator imagery. Some AI technologists I talk to about their interest in science fiction are much keener to assert that they like hard science fiction that is based on sort of more provable elements in the discussion about AI. They don't like the more fanciful things about sentient AI. But I think it's very hard, again, as I said, with the cultural context that we grow up in, religion is sort of always there in the mix. Likewise, our media representation of AI, our science fiction, the stories we see in movies and TV, they're also there in our DNA of ideas about what AI is going to be. I've been into schools and spoken to children who are quite young. I think the youngest kids I spoke to were maybe like 7 or 8. That they were doing English classes and writing stories about robots. And from a very young age, they'd already seen quite a few of the TV shows, perhaps ones that were too grown up for them. They'd already had an idea of what a science fiction robot was. They already had an idea of what robots should be able to do for us. So it's there from almost our earliest days, these stories that inform our view of what AI is going to be.
And where are the implicit religious beliefs in science that science would rather not admit to? And I'm thinking here that scientists have faith that the universe can be explained. They have faith that it's rational. They have faith that the rules are simple, and they're always trying to simplify them, and they're never simple enough for them. They have envy of Einstein for coming up with E equals mc squared and want equations that are that simple. Those are acts of faith. We could extend that as far as the singularity and some of the beliefs. And if we look beyond that to beliefs that human consciousness can be uploaded into a computer, and there's a gigantic leap of faith as opposed to some extrapolation of current technological capability. How does science incorporate religion in implicit ways?
Yeah, so when it comes to the technology of AI, there's, of course, as you say, that exponential view of determined. We're heading definitely towards the technological singularity. That kind of certainty and the evidential basis of that starts to sound a lot like eschatological thinking. So thinking about the end times, especially if it's got a vision of a ultimate transformation of humanity or the universe within it. Now, that can be apocalyptic in the dystopian sense, But if you go back to the history of religion, apocalypse didn't always mean dystopia. It could be the eruption of the norm into the utopia. So some of these visions of the singularity involve immortality in virtual environments where we've uploaded our minds and we can live forever in a digital heaven that we've created for ourselves. So in that sense, the patterns as well we're seeing in this discussion map onto existing cultural artifacts from religion. So when Elon Musk says with AI, we're summoning the demon, I don't know if I want to take that too literally, although, his engagement with Christianity is increasing. He's described himself as a cultural Christian. But if we just take it metaphorically, then you've got the implicit religiosity in the discussion around AI, the images that are picked. I've written papers on the replication of what I call the AI creation meme, the imagery of the creation of Adam remixed with the AI present, either sometimes as the creation of humanity and sometimes in a more superior godlike position as a larger robotic hand in some way or digital hand. So there's a lot of elements of very familiar religious imagery, tropery, memes, if you like, that turn up again and again in the discussion. And just the overall aspiration can be described as implicitly religious as well. The hierarchical thinking, the monotheistic perspective on AI as being something like the most simple version of a monotheistic deity, being omnipotent, omniscient, and then big question marks sometimes over omnibenevolence as well. But if you have that very simple idea of God, you can kind of see functionally how a superintelligent AI would fit into that space.
At what point did these modern tropes and end times wishes for mind uploading and so forth, at what point do those offend established religion? I mean, I could invoke Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they're proposing to build deep thought, and the philosophers object by saying, look, we spend all this time answering people's questions about, is there a God? And now you're going to build something that can just give them his phone number. I would assume that this produces friction of some kind. How does that show up?
Yes, I write in my book about the different kinds of relationship between established religions and AI, and rejection is definitely a part of that conversation. I mark out a scale. Some forms of rejection are more about practicalities, and then you go all the way up to the extent of literally, not metaphorically, but literally calling AI demonic, that it's idolatry to get involved with AI, that it distracts from the human purpose that we're on Earth for, that for some people, it's our engagement with AI and some transhumanist ideas about mind uploading are actually destructive to the nature of the human as it's been granted by a monotheistic God quite often. There's obviously polytheistic religions as well. So for some of these discussions, it's very specific that AI is a destructive force that either is coming out of the hubris of humanity or can literally be coming from a satanic angle. So I have some examples in my book of specific commentary on this. It's quite clear that to some people of faith, this is the absolute wrong direction that we're going in, and it's against God's plan.
I want to look into one of the fascinating paradoxes that was raised in your book around that we have, on the one hand, the kind of rejection that you were just talking about would reject AI as having any value to humanity, would say that it poses a threat by threatening to imitate God's creation and so forth. On the other hand, we have AI priests, and people have done this in multiple religions, and AI is taking confession, AI is leading services. You know, if any role surely required it to be inhabited by a human being with a soul, that would be it.
Yeah.
And how are these reconciled? Do they lead to even more enormous friction? I would think that there would be people picketing some of these churches.
Just to be clear, I don't believe there's an AI taking confession yet, because confession is a sacrament of the Roman Catholic Church and can't be done by anything other than a priest, a human priest. So not even women can take confession in the Roman Catholic Church. But you're right, there are absolutely spaces where people have been using not only AI avatars for engagement with conversations. There's a Jesus AI you mentioned earlier, which does take place in a confession booth, but is not for confession. And it involves an avatar. One of the members of the team happens to have a face that looks a little like the classical idea of Jesus. And it's his face and a large language model. Their sermons have been written by large language models. And you're absolutely right. For some people, this is absolutely beyond the pale. Some people turn up. You mentioned picketing. Some people do turn up for these sermons. I don't believe there's been activism so far, but they'll go to the sermon and then say afterwards, this is absolutely wrong. This is not what should be happening. And it's not just in Christianity. I've seen this as well, examples in the book of Hinduism. Some people are very pleased that there's a robot elephant in a service rather than an actual elephant because there's questions about harm to the animal. And other people saying, well, this is missing the spirits and the purpose of this religious ceremony. So there's people on both sides of the argument. Some people seeing this as perhaps enchanting for people and bringing them into the religious space. And some religious institutions are concerned about membership and attendance. And perhaps technology would be the way to engage people and engage in particular with younger people who are very interested in this as a subject. And others are very concerned that if you write a sermon with a large language model, you're missing out the spiritual content that's meant to be there.
It's another dimension to the very topical conversation about the role of using large language models in writing anything these days. And what if you use them to produce the final product instead of just giving you a leg up along the way? And I saw an example of, I think it was a robot leading, I believe, a Buddhist ceremony in Japan. It was on a stage dispensing wisdom. And I wonder how to interpret that in the context of the Japanese fascination with robots and the Shinto religion, because once again, one would have thought there was not a great shortage of priests to do this. So is it simply to produce a novel dimension to the temple to encourage people to show up just out of curiosity? Or are they exploring something that could become more predominant?
So I think there's a lot of things going on in that instance. I actually have a postdoc at the moment who's going to be doing field work at that temple in the coming year. And one of the things we discussed and I've written about a little bit is, yes, some of it is possibly performative to encourage people into the space, that this technology is interesting. But also, I mean, with the Mindar robot that you were talking about there, it's a representation of the Bodhisattva canon. And that bodhisattva can inhabit different entities and bodies and spaces. It's, avatar theory that you also see in Hinduism. So this interaction between spiritual and sacred objects and the forms and the deities that they represent is a lot closer than it has been in some Western monotheistic religions. I don't really like the Western-Eastern dichotomy, but I do still fall into it sometimes. But I think what's really important to point out is sometimes these assumptions about what is happening in Shinto temples and Buddhist temples is based on our ideas of what animism is in Japanese culture and East Asian culture and so forth. And it ignores some of the forms of animism that we encounter in other spaces around the world. There's a sort of almost techno-Orientalism sometimes that comes into the conversation that ignores that we have Western animistic traditions as well. And that lots of people, I mean, there's studies and surveys on people's supernatural beliefs in America and in Europe. Lots of people still hold on to them. They just aren't necessarily called animistic. There's this narrative that comes out of the Enlightenment and leads on that we've left these things behind. As I mentioned, religion is sometimes seen as something we're leaving behind, that we're evolving through different stages of it. And animism is often seen as an earlier stage. But when you look at superstitions and discussions of the supernatural and ghosts and spirits and locations having a weird vibe, there's a lot of these elements still in our conversations in Europe and in America and around the world, obviously.
And some years ago, the Dalai Lama said in an interview that he believed that a human could be reincarnated into a computer, and laughed about it. Wasn't clear whether he thought that would be a punishment. But if you believe that you could be reincarnated into a tree, then computer would be another possibility. Mm-hmm. You've talked in the book about some of the visions of artificial superintelligence and summoning the demon, where we get that scenario that many people like Eliezer Yudkowsky are afraid of AI running away and eventually destroying the human race. And I guess that's a counterpart to the belief that the AI will save us all. So we're recreating that God versus the devil dichotomy there again in AI. And I wonder whether this is driven by partly some lack of understanding of AI. The more magical we think AI is because we don't know how it works and we don't know how it can get there. Does that cause us to see it as being more potentially religious, potentially theistic.
Yeah, I do think that is an attribute of AI that lends itself to this more theistic interpretation. So I wrote a paper a few years back on people using the expression blessed by the algorithm. And some of the circumstances where this turn up is where the algorithm, language is fluid, AI algorithm sometimes is interchangeable. But there's spaces where this turns up is where people feel like they've had a benefit from a system they don't entirely understand the underpinnings of. So a gig economy worker getting a good series of rides and making lots of money for the day. There is a reason why the weights in the algorithm are set up by the corporation in a particular direction, but we don't, as the public, as the gig economy worker, we don't understand that. It seems more mysterious. So language like blessed by the algorithm makes sense. I would say with some of the perspectives of people like Eliezer Yudikowsky, he's someone who spent a lot of time trying to understand the technology as well. So I don't think it's so much about mystification that he sees in his logic that it's reasonable to see forms of AI performing perfectly as they should do and causing problems. So when he talks about the end of the world because of AI, it's because we've set it off to do. It's a lot like Bostrom's paperclip argument, set off AI to do a particular thing. And in order for the AI to continue to exist and have energy, it's logical for it to transform us into an energy source. So he would see himself, I've interviewed him we did a radio program for the BBC on the Terminator's anniversary, and I interviewed him for that. And he would see it eminently logical that if we continue down this path with AI, just because of its nature, and it's not that it's dispassionate, it just can't have passions, but its dispassionate nature means that logically, we are just a resource to be used. The universe, its carbon atoms are all resource to be used. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but just there are varieties of these sort of existential fears and concerns. And some of them, you're right, are more the mystification of we don't understand how AI works. So it lends itself to these sorts of interpretations of it being like a god. And then in other cases, it's just people who think they've worked through the philosophical logic of it and said, well, obviously, if we create A, we're going to get B. So there's more secular apocalypticism in that than more mystical theistic apocalypticism.
I agree. It's an engineering calculation for Yudkowsky, akin to calculating the effects of a nuclear war. And yet we have people applying the same kind of engineering approach to come up with a radically different outcome, like Ray Kurzweil forecasting singularity and only positive effects from that. That's the end of the first half of the interview. This is pretty intense stuff, right? We mentioned several people there whose writing you might like to look up for more context and extra breadth, like Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky, whom I recommend you study. We also mentioned Elon Musk, and that brings me to something I've been putting off for some time, but shouldn't avoid any longer. In my 2017 book, Crisis of Control, I spent 2 pages talking about the efforts of Elon Musk to establish a human colony on Mars and why it was important. I was positively gushing and ended with a statement, if the survival of the human race might ever be attributable to only one man, that man is likely to be Elon Musk. I'm not about to retract that statement, although I would modify the sexism that crept in there. I still think it's true, but it's a statement that I now need to qualify because it no longer lands the right way. That was 2017, and the Elon Musk we had at that point was not the same as today's model. I looked up to him. I wanted to meet him. I was in awe of him. He said and did things that were exactly what you'd want and hope for from someone who was trying to give the human race its best chance of surviving and thriving through existential threats that include AI. But starting about the time he purchased Twitter, that direction changed. I could say so much more about this. Most of us can and do, but I'll keep this brief. We all know how different the public image of Elon Musk is now. He's worked to make us a multiplanetary species, to develop brain-computer interfaces to facilitate communication with superintelligent AI, and to tackle climate change through electric vehicles and direct carbon capture are overshadowed by a mountain of toxic disinformation and partisan rancor that has divided and alienated people, to the point where I reluctantly have to consider that he might precipitate an existential crisis himself by these actions. Certainly, the social stability of the United States is going south in a hurry, and he is not helping. And given what I said about him 8 years ago, I need to make it clear I am distancing myself from that part of Elon Musk. Sam Harris, who has been a friend of Elon, said some things on his podcast about what happened to that friendship that I found very revealing and I commend to your attention. Of course, many people now revile Musk for his politics and in the process feel it necessary to embellish their position with arguments that are unfounded, unhelpful, and unnecessary. I, for one, am not about to return my Tesla. It works just as well as it did when I got it in 2019. None of that changed as a result of how he changed. More disturbingly, there's a groundswell of opposition to the SpaceX Mars colonization goals from people who just want to dump on anything associated with Musk, and that is counterproductive. Whether or not he has any designs on treating Mars as some sort of ultimate billionaire retreat, the reasons for the human race going there remain solid and vital. We need to have a viable colony off this planet to assure, or at least to make vastly more likely, the continuation of our species. Yes, there are many problems with doing that on Mars, and it may take a very long time, but if we do not start, we will never get there. And no one has moved us as far and as fast in that direction as Elon Musk. Some people argue that living on Mars would be bad because it would encourage us to be cavalier about protecting the Earth and neglect our stewardship. This is stupid nonsense. Suppose you went into your bank and got to talking to the manager about their IT practices, and they told you, "Oh, we don't make backups of our customer data like those other banks. That would just encourage us to be reckless with the main server. This way, we will take extra good care of the one source of that data." You'd close your account on the spot, quite aside from the fact that I imagine such a policy would be illegal for a bank in most countries. We could put every ounce of our energy into reversing climate change and other remediations and still get wiped out by something that wasn't even our fault, like a flip in the Earth's magnetic field, or a coronal mass ejection, or a comet, or a supervolcano. As unappealing as living on Mars would be, the people there would survive those events happening to the Earth. Back before I wrote Crisis of Control, after SpaceX had made the first 2 launches of their Falcon rocket and both failed, there's a story about their third launch, on which everything was riding because they couldn't afford another one. They launched the rocket for the 3rd time, and it failed. Everyone was in deep despair because of how hard they'd worked on it. Depression abounded in the headquarters. And then, after a little while, Elon emerged and said, "I've just done a deal to get the money for one more try, because the human race must go to space. We belong in the stars. And if you stay with us, we'll get there." And you know that he's not known for stirring delivery. He and I both have Asperger's. I know how that goes. But I get goosebumps just repeating what he said. And the SpaceX employees were so energized by that speech that they forgot how they'd just been feeling, went straight back to work, and the 4th launch succeeded. That's the Elon Musk I was writing about in 2017. I hope he comes back. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Beth Singler, when we'll talk about Rocco's basilisk, experiences of AI saying that it's a god, the reverse Garland test, that's out of Ex Machina, simulation theories, starting with Plato's cave, more chatbot priests, how Beth does research, and Battlestar Galactica. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.